Regarding the objective function, now you are sure that it is a maximizing problem, and you know it is about maximizing the projected return, and also you have the return percentage on each opportunities, and you know the decision variables are the amount of money invested in each one. So the objective function would be the return of the first case times the amount of money you put over there, plus return on the second one times amount of money you put there, and like that. Exactly similar to the previous case that we did together, if you remember, with the activities that we had. For example, you calculated if you invest $1,000 in your saving account and the return was and the return is 4%, the interest that you get was $40. How did you calculate it? 1,000 times 4%. Let me do it like this. So it is exactly the same thing, but you have also other 4 ones. So the objective function would be like this. As you can see, since they are percent, 7.3% is 0.073, and A is the amount of money you invest in Atlantic oil, or dollars invested in Atlantic oil, dollars invested in Pacific oil times the return, and like that. For the government bonds, the money invested, the dollars invested, is G times the return of the things, and since they are 4.5%, it would be 4.5 over 100. That is something like this. Feel free to ask if you have any question regarding the math, or for example these decimals you see. For the last part of the problem that we have is the constraint of the problem, and since it is a classwork, it is exactly tells you about the constraint that you have. The first constraint is about the total budget, my friends. The total amount of money they had and they wanted to do the investment, if you remember, was $100,000. That is the first constraint. That after that I'm going to give you time, so you start writing the constraint step by step. After that was the constraint that mentioned neither industry, oil or steel, should receive more than $50,000. So the amount of investment in oil industry must be smaller than 50,000. The amount of total investment in steel must be smaller than 50,000. Government bonds should be at least 25% of the steel industry investment. You know about the balance. It is something like balance constraint that we had it with the marketing example we did together. And finally, the investment in Pacific oil, the high return but high risk investment, cannot be more than 60% of the total oil industry investment. So as the first constraint that we are gonna tackle is, what is the constraint for the total budget? Pause it, think on this, think on the constraint, and write down the constraint before you check the answer. As you have noticed, it's a very straightforward type of constraint. There are 5 opportunities, and you have $100,000 amount of cash, and so the constraint was one to make sure that the amount of investment you have is not violate or surpass the amount of money available. It's very natural that when, for example, you have $10,000 for investment, the amount of investment you have in different sectors must not surpass that $10,000. So the constraint would be this: A plus P plus M plus H plus G equal to $100,000. If instead of equal to $100,000 you have put equal or smaller, it is still correct because you want to make sure that you are not violating $100,000. You are not surpassing this. So you say the amount of money that I put in each sector must be equal or smaller than $100,000. Why you can do this? Because your objective function is maximizing the return. So the model you are creating is smart enough to make the most out of this $100,000 to make the objective function as maximum as possible. Yes. So we go for the next constraint, that it talks about the fact that neither industry, oil or steel, should receive more than $50,000. The oil industry has two cases, has two companies. Steel industry has two companies. So the amount of money you put in the oil industry, that is the result of investing in those two companies in the oil industry, and also the same thing for the steel, must be equal or smaller than 50,000. Pause it, check the case if you need before you check the answer. Here are the answer for that constraint we just discussed. The amount of investment in neither industries must not surpass $50,000. What is the total amount of money you invest in the oil industry? Is A plus P. And what is the total amount of money you invest in steel industry? M plus H. So A plus P must be equal or smaller than $50,000. The same for this. When you give this model to your computer, you are sure that when you check the final answers, the total amount of investment in each industry is equal or smaller than $50,000. And that's the magic of math. You see, there is no complexity here. It is just common sense. And to have a better understanding of math, we need to connect ourselves with the applications. Okay, let's go for the next constraint. What is the constraint of government bond? What is the constraint of this? Government bonds should be at least 25% of the steel industry investments. You had similar constraint before, my friend, but not in the financial planning case. You had it with the marketing, that it says, for example, the balance for advertisement in radio must be less than 10%, 20%, 30%. It is exactly the same thing. It talks about the balance of government bonds investment in relation to the steel industry investment. So pause it, check the case, even check the marketing case, and make sure you come up with the answer yourself. Okay, let's formalize it in this way. The balance says like this: the government bonds, G, over the total investment in the steel industry, M plus H, should be at least, so it is equal or greater than 25%. You can have it in this way, or you can do the tiny little math to come up with this formula: G greater than 0.25 times M plus H. It is that formula that you have learned it in general math. So G greater than 0.25 mH, that you can see in the next slide. Okay, we continue to the next constraint. What is the constraint of the investment in Pacific Oil? Cannot be more than 60% of the total oil industry investment. Now, instead of I telling you we had the balance constraint before in marketing, I'm going to tell you it is very similar to the previous activity. So pause it and get the answer. Okay, to formalize this constraint, we are going to do the same thing. It says the investment in Pacific Oil. And since it's a balance constraint, so investment in Pacific Oil cannot be more than 60%. When it says cannot be more than something, so it is equal or smaller. And 60% like this. You see how I translate each word that I see in this constraint into math. Of the total oil industry investment, we have two companies in the oil industry, Atlantic and Pacific. So it would be the total amount of investment in the oil industry, A plus P. And after that, you can have it in this way. If you leave it in this way, it is completely correct. No problem with that. But some of you continue to make it looks better. So you make it in that way. P smaller than 0.6, A plus P. As I mentioned for the previous one, the logic behind this tiny little mass that we are doing is this X type of relation between fractions over on the two sides of equalities or even non-equalities. So we have this and this. You see, there is a X relation. And when you want to do the math here, you put the inequality sign here and you multiply them. So when you have P multiply 1, you get P. And when you have here, you have multiplication of 0.6 times A plus P. If you think you are confused with this relation, forget about it. Just write it as simple as possible, like this: P over A plus P, smaller equal than 0.6. The reason I put more explanation on this because usually I receive some messages from you that I did it this way. Is there any problem? No, it is even better. And now we can check the answer. As you can see, P, the amount of investment in Pacific, is smaller than 60% of the total investment in oil. Any way you write it is okay. When we write it like a fraction, it makes more similar to the marketing application that we had. That's the reason, because maybe some of you, even without doing the math, you say that it is the total amount of investment in oil industry, and P, the amount of investment in Pacific oil company, must be smaller than 60% of that. I have told you many times, it is the science of common sense. Everything makes sense. Any approach you take, if you are taking that approach correctly, you come up with the similar answer. Final activity is write down the full mathematical model that you just sum up everything you have written, and that's what you see. Here is the objective function. This ST is initials for subject to, the constraint. As you can see, we discussed all of them in details. And finally, the very important constraint. Never forget this constraint when you are writing down the full mathematical model. Non-negativity constraint. Hope now you have a full understanding of this financial application that we just together. Some people call it portfolio selection model. Thank you.